required ones were obviously to read relevant background literature. I also ended up participating in some of the ongoing research projects that took place, last year. And I'm also going to be helping Sasha collect and analyze data for her master's project that we are currently working on. She's currently working on in the lab. So those were kind of like the things that were on my paper and that, Scott and I signed off on. Subsequently, in the middle of the last year's school year, we actually had the opportunity to participate in a workshop with one of Scott's colleagues that kind of went over the pre-processing of smooth pursuit eye movement data. And again, this wasn't part of the required components, but honestly, I think I really learned a lot, and I just wanted to share with you guys because it is what we did ends up being very important in terms of how eye movement data is kind of cleaned up before it's actually used for meaningful analysis. So I'll talk about that too, even though it really wasn't part of like my agreement. So in terms of like the reading that I did, we had weekly lab journal club meetings throughout the fall 20, spring 21, and summer 21 semesters. So kind of what I have broken down here is kind of, I guess, like a rough kind of path or course that I took just like throughout this time. So if any of you kind of remember, during my first or second year here, I was very undecided as to what I wanted to actually do, what I wanted to research or study. So during like the actual school years, the fall 20 and the spring 21, when I was still kind of in like that limbo period, I really didn't have any like rhyme or reason to the articles that I was picking and presenting. I just was kind of looking for things that seemed interesting to me. So you can kind of see a couple of the articles that I end up presenting, just through various topics there. However, after getting through like that first year and then kind of getting into the summer semester where I had a lot more time to kind of read and dedicate towards reading of non-class stuff, I guess I should say, I began to really focus my reading kind of towards more things that could be relevant for my thesis. And ultimately where I kind of got directed to or drawn towards was the topics focusing around Levy's load theory. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about that in a few slides. But again, you can kind of see some of the topics that or papers that I covered in this more kind of like focused literature review of load theory. And ultimately, I kind of throughout the summer found like kind of my interest and my spot in which I kind of wanted to conduct my thesis. So so that's kind of ultimately what happened with my reading, which is I'm assuming the goal. In terms of the research projects that we had going on last year, there were two last year and one that kind of has sprung up here recently. But so last year I participated in in two like tandem projects, both led by undergraduate students in Scott's lab. One of those involves looking at the attentional blink phenomenon during fixation, and the other looked at the same phenomenon while engaging in pursuit. So for those of you who are not familiar or aware, the attentional blink is basically a phenomenon that when people watch a stream of stimuli, usually letters, at a rate of about 10 per second, and when the onset of a target 2 occurs 200 to 500 milliseconds after the onset of target 1, performance identifying that second target degrade pretty greatly. So what ultimately was kind of being looked at with these two tandem projects was whether or not attentional blink were the effects of attentional blink different while fixating versus pursuing. And Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there was some sort of evidence for that. But I don't want to exactly speak to that per se. But From my understanding, I believe that there is something there. And and throughout this whole process of these tandem experiments, I learned how to essentially run the experiments myself, and could ultimately collect data on myself using kind of working through MATLAB and using the lab's eye tracker. And then another research project that, and this is kind of tied into my third requirement, but I'm also participating in Sasha's master's thesis experiment on catch-up saccade suppression during pursuit in a dual task paradigm, which involves pursuing a target and tone counting. And again, in this same experience, I've also learned how to run myself and collect data on myself, and I'm currently in the process of doing that as well. Again, I kind of already mentioned this on that last slide, but I'm in the process of or I have learned how to collect data on myself, and ultimately I will use that to help Sasha collect data on participants when we're ready to kind of get that up and running. But ultimately, what this looks like for me is, I'm using MATLAB to prepare blocks of trials to be run, and I'm also kind of calibrating and just running the eye tracker, getting that set up for participants before they actually start these blocks of trials. So yeah, so that was again kind of like the last of like the required things. This slide here kind of goes into that last thing that I ended up doing, which wasn't part of our agreement, but ended up being pretty interesting nonetheless. And as I mentioned, this involved the pre-processing of smooth pursuit eye movements through like a little 2-day workshop essentially. So I have a lot of information on the slide just because when kind of preparing the presentation, I didn't one, it happened so long ago, I couldn't remember exactly what we did or why we did it. So I kind of wanted to get all that information here for you guys, just so you could have an understanding of what I did and why I did it, because I don't think it'd be very useful if neither of us understood. So, so I'm just going to kind of run you through, just some of the points, some of the important things as to why this is necessary. And again, we were just practicing it and just kind of learning about it. But this obviously happens, in the real world all the time. So it is quite relevant. So where all this begins is the fact that raw eye movement data, it needs to be converted into a form that can, be essentially worked with, and in which meaningful analyses can be done on it. And the reason for this is because the eye tracker only measures the position of the eye at a given sampling rate, which is not very useful. And just for reference, our eye tracker samples at about, I think at a rate of 1,000 hertz. So yeah, so that's kind of like, why we need to do this is because ultimately the raw eye movement data is just not useful to us. So, what we see in that eye movement data is that, during smooth pursuit, your eye is going to be making catch-up saccades. If it kind of starts to lag behind, the target while it's following it. And along with these catch-up saccades that occur, anticipatory pursuit can also occur. Anticipatory pursuit is basically when your eye kind of starts moving in the predicted direction of the target before the target has even started to move. So both of these kind of like kind of distort the data, distort the raw data a little bit, and kind of take away from the actual smooth pursuit that we are that you're actually trying to look at and to understand. And there are algorithms that are in place that can kind of determine the onset of these pursuit movements. But with anticipatory pursuit, it's it can be kind of difficult for the algorithms to detect these kind of like these movements, usually because like they're so small. So a human kind of needs to go in there and ensure that the onset of pursuit is correctly determined. Again, so you can essentially eliminate those kind of dirty parts of the data that are kind of taking away from what you're actually trying to look at. Oh, sorry about that. This picture's in the way. Okay. So yeah, so in order to to get this raw data into useful parameters such as velocity and acceleration, there's some mathematical procedures that can be used. But at the same time, all the catch-up saccades, and those little, in anticipatory pursuit kind of movements from the data must also be removed by humans so that their effects of high velocity or high acceleration won't alter the actual pursuit parameters that must be assessed. So again, it's really all about just kind of getting a cleaner picture of that smooth pursuit data that is free from these extra eye movements that aren't essentially what we're interested in. And ultimately, after this pre-processing, meaningful analysis can be carried out to determine how differences in eye latency, acceleration, velocity, or saccade frequency or magnitude has changed between conditions. And at the end of the day, a failure to kind of engage in this pre-processing will just lead to distorted results, as I've kind of mentioned already. So that's kind of like the rhyme and reason as to kind of what we did. And really, what it looked like was Scott's colleague was kind of just explaining to us how to essentially kind of code in MATLAB and get these certain files that we needed into like this raw eye movement data. And from there, we were going from trial to trial, looking at these these charts of eye movement data, looking to see if we could see these saccades, and if we did, we would perform the necessary work to actually remove those from the data and kind of essentially smooth out that smooth pursuit eye movement. Yeah, so again, it wasn't part of my required things, but I in terms of just usefulness and things that actually I think were super heavily research focused, I think this ended up actually being one of the the more exciting parts of my first year research experience. So definitely glad that we were able to do that. And then finally, kind of just to wrap up, what has all of this essentially done for me? Obviously, as I mentioned, the journal club ultimately got me closer to my thesis idea, which is kind of looking like it's going to involve a visual search task, looking into how perceptual load is affected by queuing within the framework of Levy's load theory. And again, I mentioned that I would kind of briefly explain load theory just so people could kind of understand. But basically, what it says is that the amount of load, quote unquote, that a person is experiencing at any given time will alter, how effectively they can ignore distracting information. So there's within this theory, there's two types of load: cognitive and perceptual, and both of them affect, kind of alter this ability to ignore irrelevant information in different ways. So for perceptual load, which is what I'm primarily going to be kind of looking at, this basically has to do with how much stuff is in a given scene, how many different perceptible items or what have you are within a given scene. And according to the theory, in where tasks have a low perceptual load, meaning that there's not many, it's relatively easy to kind of pick out the target, compared to the distractors. And those, or it should be at least, in those low perceptual load conditions, what ends up happening is that because attention is not fully usurped by the task, it spills over and ultimately, those distractors that are kind of part of this task end up being processed. So in the low load condition, where again, it makes sense that it should be easy to find the target, load theory predicts that it's actually kind of like the opposite way. And again, because your attentional resources have not been used, you are going to be more likely to process those distractors. And then cognitive load essentially operates in the opposite way, the opposite fashion, with high cognitive load, tasks making you more susceptible to distractors. And again, that would look, again, if you had like a task with high working, that involved a high amount of working memory usage, that could be considered a high cognitive load or something like that. So so that's kind of like the framework that I'll be working within. And essentially we're going to be kind of looking at the effects of how does queuing affect this. And ultimately, for Q targets, perceptual load effects should become, less intrusive, as hopefully the Q will facilitate, quicker target identification. But with distractors, the answer kind of remains unclear. And this is kind of how, Scott and I kind of started, looking into this, this potential direction, because if there is potentially an effect that would occur here with Q distractors, Levy's definition of perceptual load might be incorrect or incomplete in a sense. So she only claims that perceptual load can be increased by either increasing the number of different identity items that need to be perceived, or increasing the attentional demands on perceptual identification between items. So essentially, it's focusing primarily, on things within the task itself. So if something outside of the central task altered load, this would kind of be interesting and something to kind of look into. So that's kind of where essentially where we're at right now with my thesis, and that's again ultimately due to what I kind of did during during those journal clubs. In terms of research participation, I'm now much more familiarized with how experiments are run in the lab, and what various tools we have at our disposal within our lab and some of the other labs on campus. And then the pre-processing workshop was essentially my first introduction to using MATLAB, so it kind of gave me the opportunity to do that. And it also gave me the opportunity to practice a vital step in just the understanding of eye movement data, which in this case was the removal of saccades to kind of get closer to like that cleaner picture of that data. So yeah, that's kind of what my first year research experience has done for me. And that's all I have. So I'm kind of open to questions now about any of the things that I've done or that we're currently working on. So fire away if you got any.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions, anyone? Let me start to get us warmed up. I find this idea of using attentional blink with a pursuit paradigm very interesting. Can you describe what the task look like with pursuit?
So yeah, so with the pursuit task, what was happening was you would either have a this I wanted to explain this. So you'd either have like an 8-dot array, or kind of like an 8-dot array surrounding kind of like a central point, or just a central point. And essentially at this point, letters would be flashing, and this either point or array would be moving horizontally across the screen, as letters kind of interchangeably flashed at that center point. And either there would be one white letter that appeared, or two white letters that appeared. And that second white letter would obviously vary in its lag behind that first one, to kind of to either fall within or out of that kind of attentional blink window. And essentially the task was to identify the white letters that you saw. So if there was two letters, you typed the first one in, then the second. If there was only one letter you saw, you typed in the same letter twice. And yeah, and that was essentially the task. And by doing this, I believe what it kind of did was allowed allowed for like a better kind of interpretation of whether or not the first letter was seen versus the second letter, or was the first letter not seen compared to the second. So depending on what those answers look like, you could get a better understanding of what if attentional blink actually was an issue, or if this was somebody just wasn't looking, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah,
So
basically,
go ahead.
Jan, it was the attentional blink stimulus was moving, and you had to follow it.
I see.
And it was either that it was basically just the sort of the attentional blink letters that you're following, or we actually put an array of these peripheral array of dots to provide what we think basically a better object to aid pursuit.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Yeah, I look forward to read about that research. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had my hand raised.
Yes, please.
Hey, Nick, it's Valerie. I missed the rationale for the data pre-processing, but in general, throwing away data makes me nervous. So, how do you know you're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater here, or that the process that you're tossing out actually interacts with the process that you're interested in? What's sort of the logic behind that? And I ask this because I know in the text analysis work in computer science, they throw out something called stop words, which are really high frequency words. Well, it turns out there's a lot of structure and content and information in those stop words, and you shouldn't be throwing that out. So can you sort of help me understand better the rationale behind the pre-processing and your certainty that it's not really involved in, that the things you're eliminating are not involved in the processing that you are interested in?
Well, okay. So I'm first to start by saying so in this this example that I was talking about, we were specifically looking at smooth pursuit eye movement, which is I guess specific in the sense that it's a smooth kind of pursuit. Whereas saccades are very they're very abrupt, very quick instances of eye movement, which is not essentially not what we are we're interested in. We're looking at those smooth movements. In terms of the anticipatory kind of pursuit, I think it's kind of like the same deal in that those, if the eye starts moving before the target actually goes, it's usually not gonna be like kind of a soft smooth motion. It's gonna be very jerky, abrupt, high velocity, high acceleration type of motion. So for this kind of scenario specifically with smooth pursuit, I think it makes sense just in the sense that it's, again, because saccades are jerky and abrupt, it's just not within the kind of scope of what we were looking at in terms of smooth pursuit. I'm not too sure exactly what happens with
on that a little bit. So are you interested in smooth pursuit, or the manner in which that measure informs some other process?
I think maybe I can help out.
Probably.
So first of all, we're not throwing data away. That data is never gone. But as Nick said, and to answer your second question, we're really interested in purely the dynamics of the eye movement. So why are we doing this, and are we throwing, when we do this kind of removal of saccadic eye movements, are we throwing something away? Well, so there's history to this, which we don't necessarily think is correct, actually, but the history is that in the oculomotor field, the pursuit eye movement system and the saccadic eye movement system are thought to be independent. And during pursuit, as Nick said, you will inevitably make these things called catch-up saccades. And the understanding of why you make them, or when you make them, is because it turns out that our pursuit is not perfect. So if I show you a moving object and it's moving at some particular speed, and you are going to pursue it, it turns out that your eyes don't go quite the same speed as the target. So you will inevitably fall behind. And the dogma is that when your eye has gotten behind by some amount, the saccadic system, which is triggered by position error. So here, if the thought is that during pursuit, I'm trying to keep my eye on the target, but now I'm falling off the target, what people suggest is that the saccadic system gets triggered and is basically facilitating pursuit. It's not changing pursuit, but rather the saccadic system, basically there's a position error between the target and your fovea, and so it kicks you ahead. That's the catch-up saccade. And pursuit, because it's independent, is just happily going on even during that saccade. However, if you want to calculate parameters of the pursuit movement, things like what is the eye velocity, what is the acceleration, those saccades will, I mean, if you just add in the data from those saccades, well, now you're distorting. That wasn't part of the pursuit response. That was a saccadic response. So people want to separate the saccadic eye movement responses from the pursuit eye movement responses. And so that's why we have to do this pre-processing. Algorithms, we have algorithms and we use those first. We run them through an algorithmic analysis that goes through and marks in the data stream when did a saccade start? When did it end? When did pursuit start? And it's in determining when did pursuit start, which is what the anticipatory pursuit is problematic for. So the algorithms tell you, oh, your eye is moving, because they're using simply just thresholds, right? Once the eye is moving faster than some speed, it says, oh, pursuit has started, and then it basically goes back and says, when did this movement start? The problem is that with pursuit, unless you're specifically interested in anticipatory pursuit, but if you're interested in the reactive pursuit response, that is pursuit to a moving object, well, then when smooth eye movements are occurring and there is no moving object, but rather you're just sort of anticipating or predicting what's going to happen, the oculomotor folks really don't have a way of understanding what signal is driving that pursuit movement, right? Because it's not a visual stimulus, it's some representation in your head. And most of the time, not always, but most of the time, we're interested in essence, the stimulus-driven response. And so we're often interested in latency, that is, how long did it take you after the stimulus started moving, before your eye started moving, which we call latency. And in order to compute that, anticipatory pursuit basically, muddies that water. And so the algorithms tell you, oh, your eye is moving now, but it was before the target started moving. And so humans have to go in there and look and see, because it turns out it's pretty easy. Anticipatory pursuit is usually slow. And then when the stimulus starts moving, suddenly you'll see this sudden increase. And so to kind of determine when did that stimulus-driven response start, we sort of extrapolate back from that sudden increase in acceleration and go back to the 0 point on the plot to determine the latency. And algorithms just have a hard time with that.
Okay, that's certainly very helpful, and I hope you can see why I asked the question.
We're not looking at, well, that's not true. We're not always looking at the eye movement as in terms of being indicative of processing something else. We're often looking at the eye movement because we're interested in the eye movement and what is driving it stimulus-wise. There are other people who use the eye movements as indicators of other processes, and in that case, that becomes a much trickier kind of thing, because eye movements are just not, they're noisy, right?
Yeah. So is it reasonable for me to use an analogy of like separating out the frequency components behind the eye movements? Is that an okay way to think about it?
That that would certainly, you would certainly have different frequency components for a smooth pursuit versus a saccade. That's absolutely true, because saccades are just they're super fast, super high acceleration, and they don't last very long. Smooth pursuit is eye movement much slower, they last longer, and so you could think of it as frequency components, for which there are times when we look at the saccadic components during pursuit, and there are times when we don't look at them. So yeah, so that, I think that's probably a reasonable way to think about it. If that's something that, if that's a way that helps you understand it, I think that that's reasonable.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions from the audience? So this is just an opinion that came to my mind when I listened to Scott's excellent explanation. So it looks like, to me, as kind of a naive observer of this field, if we are interested in the actual pursuit, this is more like an interaction. And when I say actual pursuit, I mean the one that is functional for whatever task the agent is trying to do, the human is trying to do. So it looks like it's an interaction between the pursuit, what Scott defines as pursuit, or the smooth pursuit, the plus catch-up saccades plus anticipatory pursuit. They all work together to do the task, which is to follow the object, to track the object, right? Because you do need to represent something in your mind in order to catch up with the object. Otherwise, if you just use the external stimulus and you don't try to do any kind of anticipations, you might not be as good as tracking the object.
Well, I think I'm not sure Nick is equipped to answer that completely.
I have a thought, but yeah, I don't know if it would be like, you know.
So it turns out that there are people who are interested in the anticipatory part. And clearly, the anticipatory part of that response is being generated by predictive mechanisms in the brain. Our brain is full of predictive stuff, right? In fact, it's almost by necessity has to, because our perception is at least 100 milliseconds behind physical reality. Let alone that the fact that our perception may include things that are part of physical reality, and things that we create, because perception is created in our heads. So prediction is necessary. And my colleague in California has studied some predictive, looked at the single cell recording and has looked at predictive stuff. That becomes, so there are people who are interested in that, and that's why they're interested in it, because this tells us something about how the brain is using past experience and expectation to, as you said, Jan, actually facilitate. I mean, I would say that the anticipatory pursuit comes from knowing or realizing, although I think consciously, I don't think we're very much aware of it, but I think the brain knows, you know what, when that thing starts moving, I'm always behind. So I'm just gonna, set myself up to do better. And even monkeys will do this. In fact, we did an experiment with the monkeys where we tried to get them, tried to train them to pursue an accelerating stimulus. So it's just going to start off and just accelerate at a constant rate. So it turns out, and we never published this, we just did the we sort of made a casual observation. We published a paper about humans and how we can't we can't pursue accelerating things very well. Well, this monkey, what we did is we just gave this monkey the same trial over and over and over and over again. And eventually the monkey did learn something. What he learned is that I can't follow this damn thing. And so what he did was, rather than just anticipatory pursuit, he just blasted his eye really fast so that by by the end of the screen, basically the dot caught up to him and not the other way around. So that's smart, right? I mean, it's exactly what you said. I mean, because he's going to get rewarded for being on the spot. And so, I mean, that in and of itself is a fascinating kind of topic. But not everyone, often, as is the case with many sort of low-level psychophysics kind of folks, we often are interested in, given a particular input, what is your motor response? Rather than, oh, you're now expecting something and you're going to generate a response based upon that expectation. And so people used to, often what they do is change the direction of the target randomly from trial to trial. So then what happens is, in fact, the pattern is if I just saw something go to the right, the next trial, I tend to anticipate to the right. And if it moves to the left, it's like, uh-oh, and then you have to zip back. And of course, when you average those together, it looks like you've actually eliminated anticipatory pursuit because the left or the right word cancel out. But you haven't. It's there on a trial by trial basis. So it is an interesting topic, an interesting thing to study. We weren't studying that in this case. And so, and one of the things that this idea of latency is often looked at as a sign to tell you something about how long the processing is that's going on in order to finally generate that motor command. And anticipatory pursuit really, at least for the algorithms, completely, occludes finding an accurate measure of latency. And so humans have to get into that analysis loop. And I mean, we literally look at every trial and make sure to see if the algorithm looks like it did a reasonable job or if there's something else going on that we're going to need to basically correct for the kind of analysis that we want to do. But it is yeah, the whole brain is about prediction. So that anticipatory pursuit is an interesting.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, you need to break things down and separate them into components before you look at their interaction.
Yes.
So do we have other questions or comments for Nick? And obviously, we're here in the general discussion kind of section. If you have questions or comments of any nature, now it's time to address them. And if not, then we can stop here. And let me just remind you all that I'm looking for volunteers for the next brown bag talks. So feel free to contact me with your idea about what you can present or facilitate a discussion. anything that would make our program interesting. Thank you all. Have a good weekend.
See ya.
Thanks everyone for listening. Appreciate it. Good one.